So most of the success stories we hear about in machine learning these days involve a clear prediction goal combined with a massive training data set. But a lot of problems that we wish to solve just simply don't fit this bill. So in this talk, I'm going to focus in on learning from time series and discuss some of the open challenges as well as some paths forward to start handling more limited data scenarios and getting at notions of interpretability. So it's going to be a slightly more pessimistic talk than the last one we just heard about deep learning and all it can do, but it is an amazing, amazing tool, but there are some important limitations we need to think about. Okay, so the first thing that I think is important to hammer home is the fact that time series data appear everywhere. And that statement's increasingly true based on the development of new recording devices and platforms. So for example, this picture here might represent anything from streams of posts or views of users on these platforms to purchase histories of these users on these e-commerce sites. There's also been the development of a lot of wearable devices that provide us with interesting streams of activity data. Or in the field of healthcare, there have been advances like electronic health records and different monitoring devices that allow us to start assessing a patient's health status over time. But for the most part, machine learning has really ignored time series. And the question is why? Well, it's hard. Typically, the number of parameters associated with our models grow really rapidly with the number of series we're observing or with the complexity of the dynamics we wish to capture. So it means we need that much more data to start learning effectively. Likewise, the algorithms associated with these models tend to be much more computationally intensive per data point, which means we need that much more compute power to start addressing these problems. And finally, the theoretical results that we like to be able to establish tend to assume independent observations, and they're hard to extend to these time-dependent scenarios. So what should we do? Should we just give up on time series and treat the data as if they were independent? Well, to see why that might not be a good idea, let's think about a challenge I'm faced with every week when I go to book a restaurant for my family. Because my son always likes either pizza or sushi. And so if I'm just going to guess at random which restaurant he's going to want, I'm going to get it right about 50% of the time. But if I take into account the fact that if we just had sushi, he's very likely to want pizza or vice versa, I can start getting much better prediction accuracy, maybe something like 90%. There's a lot of feedback. I don't know if you can turn it down a little, sorry. So hopefully I've proven to you guys the importance of dynamical modeling, capturing dependencies over time in our observations. Okay, well, really, the analysis of time series or sequential data more generally is all the rage right now. And that's due to a confluence of factors. One is the presence of these massive web-scale time series or sequential data sources combined with huge compute power, as well as advances that have been made in deep learning that have led to a number of success stories. So for example, recurrent neural networks and different variants like LSTMs, GRUs, WaveNet, seek-to-seek, these different architectures underlie success stories we've seen in a number of different scenarios, including reinforcement learning, speech generation, machine translation, speech recognition, NLP, healthcare, and the list goes on and on. But there are really three critical challenges or components to these success stories. One is the presence of this massive time series out there, often in the form of lots and lots of replicated series. So for example, we have lots of correspondence data, or lots of examples of a robot navigating every part of a maze, or lots of transcribed audio. But in a lot of applications, especially scientific applications, that isn't the case. Or sometimes we have lots of data, but we don't have lots of data for our particular question of interest. So for example, imagine that we're Amazon, and we're trying to forecast the next year of demand of every product in our inventory. So we have tons and tons of purchase histories, but what if we get a new product? How do we forecast its demand? So that's an example of having very little, no data for that particular question of interest. The other really critical component is something I call having manageable contextual memory. So recurrent neural networks, or RNNs, are touted as having this really powerful ability to capture a rich historical context to the sequential input. And that's indeed true, but the big success stories we've seen are in cases where there's a lot of structure to that input sequence. So for example, out of our massive data set that we have available, it's very likely that I've seen this structure in a maze before, or I've seen words used in this context or a similar context before, or I've seen a patient with these types of symptoms and test results. But what if you're trying to forecast a really complicated weather system? And you have a whole bunch of variables you're observing. This is a very nonlinear, noisy process. And to start learning effectively, you just need an enormous, I don't know how many times I say that word, enormous amount of data. And so if you just threw this data at an RNN, I don't think you'd get the type of performance that I'd hope to get if you leveraged prior beliefs about structured relationships between these different variables that you're observing. And the last really critical component to the success stories we've seen is having a clear prediction objective. So for example, there's word error rate for speech recognition, BLUE score for machine translation, and the reward function in reinforcement learning. So what we're going to do in this talk is think about moving beyond prediction tasks on these really massive data sets and talk about a number of other important time series analysis tasks. One is thinking about characterizing the underlying dynamics of the process that we're observing. Another is thinking about efficiently sharing information in more limited data scenarios. And the last one that we're going to spend the most time on is thinking about learning interpretable structures of interactions amongst the different series that we're observing. Okay, well, let's start with this goal of characterizing the underlying dynamics. And for this, let's think about observing and trying to characterize human motion. And here what we have is some motion capture data where these people wear these suits with all these sensors that provide recordings of joint angles over time. So the recordings look something like this. And it looks like a really complicated process. And you'd imagine having to use a really complex dynamical model in order to capture the evolution of this process. But really, you can describe that process as switches between a set of simpler dynamic behaviors, like the person is doing jumping jacks, arm circles, side twists, and so on. So then the questions are, what are the dynamics that are used to describe each one of these simpler behaviors? How many behaviors are present in this recording? And what if new behaviors appear over time? And another question, of course, is what is the switching pattern between these different behaviors? So we developed a fully unsupervised technique. So unsupervised learning is possible. You don't need training labels always. So this is just an example of some of the behaviors that we discovered in a large collection of motion capture videos that we analyzed with this model. And all of the labels that you see here are things that we added post facto. Okay, but the high level idea is that this idea of taking complex dynamics and describing them as switches between a set of simpler dynamic behaviors appears in lots of different contexts. Some that my groups analyzed include automatically parsing EEG recordings, segmenting conference audio, detecting regime changes of volatility and financial indices, or segmenting a human chromatin sequence. But overall, this framework, amongst many other traditional time series analysis frameworks, are very powerful for describing these underlying processes. And I think there are ways where deep learning methods can be combined with these particular frameworks to get at more flexible descriptions of individual behaviors, but allow more meaningful and interpretable information to be extracted. Okay, what I'd like to talk about now is thinking about efficiently sharing information in limited data scenarios. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold, so excuse my hoarseness here. So let's return to this example of being Amazon and trying to forecast demand for products. So we might have things like skis and ski jackets that are purchased more in winter months. Maybe we have roasting pans that are purchased around holidays, running shoes in the spring. Car seats might not have much of a seasonal trend at all. So the question is, how do I forecast the next year of demand for each of these products in order to stock my inventory? And a really critical question we talked about is, what if we have a new product? How do we start addressing that problem? So again, this is an example of a prediction task where we don't have a lot of data for our particular question of interest. Okay, so the model that we developed leverages repeated patterns you see both across years and across products. And then we combine that structure with a regression component that builds in side information we might have. For example, features of text associated with product descriptions. And for this regression component, we used a neural network as a function approximator here. So this is just a really simple example of how neural networks can be built into structured models to give us nice flexibility, but in the context of more limited data scenarios. So we use this model to analyze some Wikipedia data. So we're looking at page traffic over time and using that as a proxy for product demand. We didn't actually have data from Amazon for this. So the side information we're using are looking at features of text of these article summaries. And I'm just going to show a few qualitative results here. So here's one article where we have past years of this article in our training data set. And this is a held out year. And this is the page traffic over the entire year. This is the true page traffic. And this is our forecast. So you can see that we're able to capture this weakly oscillatory structure as well as this more global structure by leveraging these repeated patterns we see both across this article as well as related articles. Here's another article where we're trying to do what's called a cold start forecast. So this is an article where we have no past history of this article in our training data set. But again, by leveraging relationships with similar articles, we see that we're able to capture, again, this weakly oscillatory structure as well as more global trends. Okay, well, I promised that we were going to move away from prediction tasks, and we will. And so the first example of this is a collaboration that my groups had with Zillow, where the goal is to model a local level housing index. So in particular, we're trying to assess the value of housing at a local level like a census tract and how that value changes over time. The challenge, however, is the fact that the data are spatiotemporally really, really sparse. So to get a sense of this, we can look at the following chart, and we see that more than 10% of census tracts have fewer than one house sale on average per month, and more than 40% have fewer than 3. So we can look at this visually. Here's one census tract. We're looking at time, price, and each dot is a different house sale. So this census tract has tons of house sales, lots of data. And our goal is to estimate this red curve, so the latent value in that tract over time, as well as this band of uncertainty. So it doesn't look too hard in that scenario. But here's another census tract that is hard to see, but it has 4 house sales over a 17-year period. How do you hope to start analyzing things in these types of truly data-scarce situations? Well, the approach we're going to take is one of discovering clusters of neighborhoods that have correlated latent price dynamics. So maybe we discover that these neighborhoods all move together, and these neighborhoods move together but different from the first set, and so on. Because if we can discover this structure, what allows us to do is share information between related neighborhoods and thus improve the robustness of our estimates. So we use this model to analyze some City of Seattle data. So here's Seattle broken down into different census tracts, and the color of each one of these census tracts is our inferred cluster label. So we discovered that there are 16 different clusters, and for each of those 16 clusters, I'm showing the value, the average value in that cluster over time. And there's a lot of intuitive structure. So for example, here's the downtown region in Seattle, which had the largest bust and boom cycle over this time period. And there's more structure you can read about in the paper. But another thing we can do is a more quantitative analysis. And for this, we can look at predicting held out house sales. And I said we're not interested in prediction, and we're not, but we can use this as a proxy for assessing the quality of our underlying index. And we're going to compare our index to the industry standard Case-Shiller index. And we're going to look at the percent improvement of the predictions we're forming over what you can form using Case-Shiller. And we're looking at dividing our analyses into the 5% of census tracts with the most observations, all the way to the 5% with the fewest. And across the board, we have improvements. But not surprisingly, the case where we have the largest improvements are for the census tracts with the fewest number of observations, because this is the case where sharing information is so critical. Okay, so just to step back, what we're talking about are structures for thinking about efficiently sharing information. So this is something my groups thought a lot about over past years, thinking about clusters and hierarchies of time series, thinking about sparse directed interactions, low dimensional embedding. So the long-range forecasting product demand that we were talking about is really thinking about this low-dimensional structure that lives in the data. Even the method we talked about at the beginning where we're switching between behaviors, that's a way of sharing information across time as you see behaviors appear again and again. And once again, the story is that these are really powerful frameworks. And there are a lot of ways, in some ways that my group's exploring, of combining deep learning techniques with these types of frameworks that allow us to handle more limited data scenarios. Okay, so the last part that I want to dig into in a bit more depth is thinking about learning interpretable structures of interactions. And so to do this, we're going to discuss this in the context of deep generative models. So the goal of deep generative models is to synthesize data. So for example, maybe we have a bunch of images of handwritten digits, the famous MNIST data set. And maybe we'd like to synthesize new images of handwritten digits that cover the space of all possible things that people might write. So for example, in the last talk, we heard that the US Postal Service has been using digit recognition, handwritten digit recognition. This might be a reason why we want to have these types of training examples for these algorithms. Okay. Deep generative models take a probabilistic approach to this, thinking about defining a distribution over these complex observations. And these methods are really powerful. So one example coming out of a team at Apple is the following. They use deep generative models to synthesize images of eyes, and they combine those with an unlabeled data set of real images of eyes and use those to refine their synthetic images. And that paper won the Best Paper Award at the prestigious CVPR conference in 2017. Right here in Seattle, there's a team at the Allen Institute for Cell Sciences that use these types of methods for predicting the location of cellular structures throughout the cell cycle. So their training data in this case, though, only included examples of where the cellular envelope was and the nucleus and an individual cellular structure at a given time. So this is really cool stuff. But the challenge in defining these kind of methods is that you need a very flexible distribution to describe these complex observations, but you need a distribution that you can learn and one that you can sample from in order to simulate or synthesize these data sets. And examples of techniques that have been proposed to do this include variational autoencoders, generative adversarial networks, and there are many, many, many variants. Okay, so we're going to focus in on variational autoencoders, or VAEs. And what VAEs do is they define what's called an encoder. And in a VAE, it uses a neural network mapping from a data point to a latent code, a latent embedding of that data. So we think about taking our high-dimensional complex observation, like our handwritten digit, shoving it through our encoder, and it defines some low-dimensional embedding, really a distribution on a low-dimensional space, but you can ignore that part. Then the other part is a decoder, which is again defined by a neural network that maps from our low-dimensional latent space back to our high-dimensional observations. So in particular, we think about sampling from this low-dimensional distribution, which is some particular point in that space. You shove it through this decoder, and that synthesizes a high-dimensional observation. And what the VAE does is it jointly trains this encoder and decoder to optimize something called a variational objective. And really what we can think of doing is taking all of our training data, shoving it through an encoder, and then what we're going to do is sample from this latent space, synthesize a whole bunch of different data points, or images in this case, look at the differences between our real data and our synthetic data that we generated. And from those differences, that's going to drive the update to the neural network parameters underlying this encoder and decoder. And then we iterate this process, hoping to be able to generate data that's closer to our real data set. Okay, there's a lot of neural network magic buried under the hood here, but that's the high-level idea. Okay, so VAEs are really cool, but there are a number of limitations. One is the fact that you just need a tremendous amount of data to start defining good generative models, good synthesizers. Another is the fact that it's really hard to interpret what's going on. So for example, it's really hard to understand how changes in your latent code, that low-dimensional space, influence changes in your really high-dimensional observation space. So let's imagine we're trying to synthesize human body pose positions. Well, what if we just wanted to move an arm? If we took a new sample from our VAE, we'd almost surely get a completely different pose altogether. Okay, well, there are lots of cases. Most of the time when we're thinking about complex high-dimensional observations, we can actually think of those observations as collections of groups of really correlated random variables. So for example, in human motion, each joint is a collection of very correlated angle measurements. Or if we're looking at neuroimaging data, we tend to do something called a region of interest analysis, where we have a bunch of cortically localized signals that are highly correlated. Or in finance, we have a whole bunch of different indices, but they're associated with different asset classes, which tend to be very correlated. So a question is, how do changes in our latent code, that low-dimensional latent code, influence these groups of highly correlated observations? Okay, well, to see why the VAE can't address this question, let's just revisit what it's doing. We're going to think about embedding frames of a video of a person walking. So we take each of those frames, shove it through our encoder, get this distribution on latent codes, sample a particular latent code, which in this example is just a two-dimensional vector. And then the neural network that's defining the decoder entangles both of those dimensions in a really complicated way to synthesize these high-dimensional observations. So there's no sense of how one dimension versus another is influencing this overall observation. But instead, what we propose doing is defining a separate decoder for each group of observations. So for example, one decoder for the neck, one for the elbow, one for the knee, and so on. Even though we have these separate decoders, they're all coupled because they're jointly trained together with the encoder, and they also share the same latent space. And we refer to this model as the OIVE, Output Interpretable VAE. And I have to be honest, the acronym came before the name because there's just been a million different variants of GANs and VAEs proposed out there, and they all have their own cute little name. And we just felt jaded and didn't really want to contribute to all of this, and we kind of just said OIVE, and it stuck. So then we had to make it Output Interpretable. But to make it interpretable, what we do is we add what's called a sparsity-inducing penalty on the weights that map from this latent code to each of these group-specific decoders. So what it allows us to do is infer that, for example, this first dimension might only be relevant in describing the motion of the elbow and knees, but not the neck. And maybe the second dimension is really important for describing what's going on with the neck, but not elbow and knees. Okay, well, I'm just going to show you some results from training this OIVE on just 10 short videos of a person walking, so really limited data scenario. And what we can look at is we can look at this weights matrix that maps what's going on in our different latent dimensions to each of our groups of observations, each joint in the human body. And it's a sparse matrix, so it's interpretable. So we can start asking questions like, for a given joint, which latent dimensions are controlling its motion? Or we can also say, for a given latent dimension, which joints does it control? So for this, here we're going to show in this table for every latent dimension, the set of joints that it controls, top 3 joints. And this is very interpretable. So for example, this one right here corresponds to controlling right lower arm, right wrist, right upper arm. So I'm showing that here. And you can walk through every dimension. This first dimension controls aspects of the left lower leg, and this one controls aspects of the head and neck. And this is all learned. It's learning this structure from the data, learning these systems of interaction. You might think that this gain in interpretability comes at a loss of flexibility of representation, but we show in the paper that that is not the case, especially in limited data scenarios. And I'll just show some qualitative examples here. If you think about just sampling at random a latent code, passing it through the decoder, I'm first going to show you results from the VAE. So this is our trained VAE, vanilla VAE. And my students like to call these samples from the Ministry of Silly Walks, because, for example, this guy's leg looks like it's broken. Here, I don't think I've ever hit that pose in human motion. But here are samples from our OIVE. Look much more representative of human motion. And these are just a few samples, but you can see a much larger set in the paper, and the same story holds. And the idea is by capturing these groups of interaction and leveraging these important relationships that exist to describe these high-dimensional observations, we're better utilizing our available data. Okay, well, we also apply this to looking at some neuroimaging data, where a person sits in this chair, has all these sensors that provide recordings of brain activations over time. And we do this region of interest analysis. And here, what we're interested in are defining networks in the brain, understanding which regions of interest work together in response to different stimuli. So we can again look at this weights matrix. And if we look at the different latent dimensions here, what we see is that they control regions of interest that comprise known networks in the brain. So this is cool. Okay, so what we've talked about so far is structuring the decoder in a VAE. But what if you think about doing the same thing on the encoder side? Well, you have to think carefully about how you're going to merge together these different encodings to get this latent embedding. And I won't go through the details. You can read about them if you're interested. But I just want to tell you what it allows you to do. Because just like they mentioned in the last talk, Paige mentioned, sorry, this is where I lose my voice, better than 2 weeks ago when I had no voice at all. So a lot of our data sets are very messy, right? They have a lot of missing data. And VAEs just choke on missing data. So here, though, we can have an entire missing group of observations, like maybe the elbow sensor goes out. And we can still do our training and testing with this. Likewise, we can also handle multimodal data sources. So we can run VAEs on things like video, audio, and text together, treating these as different groups. So I'll just quickly show, some results here. What we did was, again, train on these motion capture videos. And in training, just to make things harder, we randomly removed whole limbs. Okay, so lots of missing data. And then at test time, what we're going to do is only give you observations that are highlighted in orange. So we're only going to give you observations of the person's body core and ask our VAE to synthesize everything else. And you're seeing the true in gray or blue, whatever this is. And here's what we synthesize. So it matches really closely just from information about where a person's head, neck, and core are. You synthesize all the limbs. Okay, another separate example is if you have multi-view data. So for example, you have different views of a person's face. In this case, what we did was we held out one view, we passed in the 6 other views, and asked the VAE to synthesize the held out view. And each one of these images you're seeing here is a synthetic image. Each one is hold out 6 of the other views, synthesize an image. So really realistic looking synthesized images. Very limited data setting, actually. So again, very cool stuff. Okay, in the last 2 minutes, don't worry, 2 minutes, I'm going to talk about exactly the same idea, but in the context of an explicit dynamical model. So in particular, we're going to be interested in directed interactions in time series. So we want to be able to make statements like, maybe time series I is influencing time series J at some lag. And we'd like to be able to discover that kind of structure from the data. And of particular interest, and the really key thing, is in nonlinear complex time series. And so to do this, again, I won't talk about the model, but it has very similar flavor to what we talked about with OIV. We take neural networks, we consider structured representations with these sparsity-inducing penalties, where if you shrink away these weights, what you're able to make statements about is the fact that time series I does not influence time series J because its weights got shrunk to 0. So some details in that, but it's the same kind of idea. And I just want to mention some of our results. So we looked at the DREAM3 challenge data set. So this is a benchmark data set for Granger causality techniques. And it's simulated gene regulatory network data, very nonlinear data. And we have 5 networks, 2 E. coli, 3 yeast. And these are 100-dimensional networks. Again, really complicated nonlinear dynamics. And we only get 46 replicates of 21 time points. So that's really insanely little data for this kind of problem. And here's some results in terms of our ability to do structure learning, to be able to detect true versus false edges. So it's a metric called area under the ROC curve. And here's our performance using a multi-layer perceptron. Here's our performance using an LSTM, a popular RNN. Here's the performance of a past nonlinear gold standard Granger causality method. Here's the linear model and something called a dynamic Bayesian network. But what you see is across the board, we have significant gains using these neural network approaches. And I would not have thought about using neural networks for this kind of problem a couple years ago. First, it's structure learning, not prediction. Never seen that before. And it's really, really limited data. So very non-traditional use, but you see some important gains there. So in summary, I do think there are really tremendous opportunities for deep learning. I think they allow us to go beyond simple assumptions like linearity, Gaussianity, and so on. But the problems that we're interested in are much faster than just prediction tasks on massive data sets that you see in lots of companies out there that have been driving this deep learning revolution. And so we've shown two examples, the OIVE and this neural Granger causality, for thinking about looking at structured representations of these neural networks with sparsity-inducing penalties that allow us to get at notions of interpretability, handle limited data scenarios. And I really think that this is just the tip of the iceberg of what can be done to handle a much vaster set of problems. I just also want to thank the students and postdocs that were involved in this project, especially those that were involved with the OIVE and neural Granger projects. And also, if you want to learn more about machine learning, just a plug for a Coursera machine learning specialization that I, together with Carlos Gestrin, that you might have heard from this morning, co-developed. So thank you.
Thank you, Emily. I do a wave of new professors who've come in over the last 5-6 years.
Yeah.
What have the changes been that you've seen there in particular? Or I guess,
it's interesting. While industry has exploded with practical machine learning, deep learning, and there's obviously a lot still going on campus, there's been a little bit of a, backlash, a little bit of a let's go back to theory. So UW has hired a lot of really fantastic people on the more theory side of ML, which is really critical to start. Traditionally in machine learning, it was absolutely a must to be able to have a statement about the properties of what you were doing and to be able to say some kind of guarantees of how it's going to perform as you get more data or as you let your algorithm run more and more. And we've kind of lost that a little bit. We're kind of in this gung-ho, which is, it's fun and it's cool and you can do cool things, but I think a lot of us on the research side of things are trying to slow down a little bit and think about what can we do and what can't we do and what can we say about what we can do. And a lot of things we can do, but we don't know why we can do them. And so I think a lot of us are thinking more in that space.
One of the examples you showed was your collaboration with Zillow.
Right.
How does something like that come about if there are companies out here in the audience that would want to?
It's exactly through this kind of thing. Heard me give a talk and then reached out, and Zillow and I have been working together actually basically since I got to UW, a number of projects. I had to cut one for time. We had a really interesting paper on analyzing the dynamics of homelessness and a whole slew of different things that you can think about. But yeah, that's how these things happen.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, with that, if there aren't any specific questions from the audience. Oh, yes, I thought so, yeah. I know, just a little bit.
Yeah.
My question is, have you combined any of these neural net methods with traditional time series forecasting methods like ARIMA or exponential smoothing or seasonal decomposition?
Yes, we have a paper in the works. So to kind of, halfway answer your question, the forecasting, that's picking up on seasonal models. It's not actually explicitly a seasonal model, but that's exactly what it's trying to capture as seasonal trends. But we have a project right now that's we have two separate ones that are related that are using these more traditional processes. This is something that's really interesting to think about. So ARIMA, if you guys aren't familiar, it captures long memory in processes. RNNs are supposed to capture long memory in processes, but it's a very different notion of long memory. It's not long memory, it's context. It's a contextual memory. And these ideas of attention mechanisms change that even to another level about context and relevance of information. And so we're doing a lot of studies trying to compare these and combine these different ideas. I think it's really important to kind of better understand what's going on there. But yeah.
Is there another question back here? Yeah, go ahead.
Describe or just elaborate on computational power.
Yeah. So I have two answers to you. Sorry.
Let me repeat that.
Yeah.
The question is about the computational power needed to pull off something like this, and the second part was, did you say the pliability?
It's really more, how do you get some of the earlier things we talked about?
Right. Yeah.
Got it.
I can say that none of these things were run on GPUs. These were all CPU based. Actually, that's the one exception to that was the face thing, because we used some pre-trained models and the synthesizing images of faces. But so I'm looking at really limited data situations. So I have two answers. One is, if you go out there in industry and you have your massive data set and you're trying to train a model yourself and not just grab one off the shelf and then do the last few layers, massive, massive amount. What we're doing, I mean, embarrassingly small amount of compute resources, but that's kind of cool, right? It's like, it's really taking these methods out of their traditional comfort zone and where they've been developed and showing that you can do the kind of more traditional things. Yeah, so they are very compute hungry. And something that wasn't mentioned, that I think it wasn't mentioned, unless I fell asleep for a second, but tuning parameters. Oh my God, tuning parameters and like just 99.999% of machine learning and time is spent on tuning parameters, and that is super compute hungry. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to say absolutely how much, but I can tell you these are all local analyses. Yeah. I mean, we do things in the cloud, and we use AWS quite a bit, but it's not the scale of things that people do with the massive training sets that they're looking at. Yeah.
That's great. Emily Fox, thank you very much.
Thank you.